continuing with a sukkah, and material. It says here, one of the sections is materials that you can use for the walls of a sukkah. The walls of a sukkah, and it says here all materials are permissible for the walls of a sukkah. Some say that a pious person should probably only use materials that aren't biblically unfit for a sukkah, such as items that have a foul-smelling odor, and obviously, if you use like a billboard or something, or a piece of a billboard with inappropriate pictures, that's not exactly appropriate for a sukkah, because a sukkah is a holy place during the week of Sukkot, and the holiness comes from the actual schach. Okay, many authorities hold that plastic curtains, tarpaulin, or canvas are unfit for walls, while others permit that. This is not because of an issue with the material, but because it's an issue with it blowing in the wind. In terms of schach has to be, you can't use like a branch of a tree that's overhanging, that's still attached to the stump. It has to be detached, has to be cut and placed on top of the sukkah. And if the sukkah is made, last point, I'm just ad-libbing here. If the sukkah is made of like a steel frame, and the vertical bars are steel framed, and the horizontal, all of them, you can't lay the schach on top of that, because it's considered that it makabels tumah, it can receive impurity. So you have to put what a lot of people do is put wooden beams on top of this frame, and then put the schach on top of that to avoid having tumah in the sukkah. So that's just wanted to say that. If you guys are building a sukkah, I don't know, Gavin, if you have one in your complex, or Damon, you can. I'm sure where Damon is, the people are very capable. They know what they're doing. They know the halachot. So
we don't have one. That's why I'm looking at moving it.
Oh, is it? Okay.
No, I'm joking, man. No, we can get one.
You can just go to your the corner house there, Gavin.
We nearly got one. We nearly got a second-hand one. We got offered one, but she wouldn't negotiate on price, so we actually scrapped it because it wasn't worth it unless we were getting a good deal. It was second-hand.
No, exactly.
Yeah. We gave her an offer. She didn't accept it, so we just left it.
Well, then she was okay. That's
yeah.
it.
So we'll try again next year. So we don't have one. All right, let's get going.
All right, let's get going, guys. All right, so listen.
Carol.
We were yesterday. We were talking about this issue with Rav Ashi and etc., and Rav Ashia and Rav Yirmiyah, etc. So the Gemara basically now, we in the 112th daf, elaborates on that question of accepting testimony when the litigant against whom it is directed is not present. So how did this issue come up? It says, well, technically, according to Sumkus, if you want to summons a minor to a court trial, you can't, because he's not present, as in maybe he might be physically present, but he's not presence of mind in terms of maturity, just like somebody that's mentally incompetent and hasn't reached their full level of maturity in terms of consequence of decision. So we're saying on the subject of somebody that is not present, can there be a court case where there's a litigant, either the plaintiff is not present or the defendant is not present or witnesses are not present? What can you do if one of the parties is not present? So according to Rav Ashi, who was actually, you must know who Rav Ashi is, he's the redactor of the Talmud. So although he was born many years after the passing of Rav Yochanan, and Rav Yochanan, if you remember yesterday, responded to the statement made by Rav Ashi. So it seems weird. How could it be if the timeline seems to be confused? So it seems that Rav Ashi mentioned here is a different Rav Ashi who redacted the Talmud afterwards. But he was an earlier Amoira. So there's 2 Rav Ashis, by the way. So that's something that one has to just bear in mind. But anyway, Rav Ashi said in the name of Rav Shabsai, we accept the testimony of witnesses even in the absence of the litigant against whom it is directed. Okay, which means we can accept the testimony of witnesses even if the litigant against whom it is directed is absent. Who is the litigant that a trial is against? It's against the defendant, because the plaintiff is the one issuing the summons and the defendant is the one defending the action. So even if the defendant is not there, you can still get the testimony from the witnesses in terms of taking affidavits, etc. In terms of court presentation, that's a different matter. And that's why Rav Yochanan is confounded by the ruling, because he said, listen, do we really accept testimony of witnesses in the absence of the litigant? Because when it's a court trial, the defendant has to be there. So the ruling is explained in saying, well, what circumstances? So according to Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, who received it from Rav Yochanan, that obviously it's inconceivable that Rav Ashi would allow a court to accept testimony in the absence of the litigant. But the extenuating circumstance, according to Rav Yochanan, that Rav Ashi has to be referring to a very, very specific case, and that is where he is ill. So who is ill? The plaintiff is ill, not the defendant. So in other words, the plaintiff, the one suing, is soon might die, and he's concerned that his children, who are unfamiliar with the case, are not going to present the witness's testimony properly. So he wants to make sure that the defendant pays up before he dies, so that his children will get what's due to them. So that's an exceptional case. Or you've got a case where the witnesses are ill. In other words, the witnesses may be in danger of dying or going to war or getting cancer, who knows? So if they don't testify now, there might never be another chance, according to Rashi, as far as that's concerned. Or you've got a case where the witnesses go overseas. There's nothing as dramatic as death, but they're getting a job overseas or they're restationed elsewhere, and therefore the court can summons the defendant, but if the defendant didn't come, it's his problem. So what do you mean the court summoned the defendant? It's not an alternative circumstance, but actually refers to cases listed earlier. So even if the plaintiff is ill, or the witnesses are ill, or they plan to travel overseas, the court will not accept the witness's testimony unless it first summoned the defendant so that he can hear the testimony against him. So only if the defendant failed to obey the summons, he's evidently decided he doesn't need to hear the testimony, and then therefore the witnesses can proceed in his absence. You get what I'm saying? Even if there are extenuating circumstances for the plaintiff and witness, the defendant still has to be summoned. If he doesn't come, it's the defendant's problem. Now, there's another ruling on this issue. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, we accept witnesses even in the absence of the litigant. So what do we mean? Ma Ukva said, it was explained to me personally by Shmuel that his ruling applies only when the court had opened his case and they had summoned the defendant, but he did not come. So we're saying is here the plaintiff and the defendant had already made their claims before the court. They made their statements. So according to the Rosh. But when the plaintiff was about to present his witnesses, the court summoned the defendant so that he would actually be able to hear the testimony against him. So again, that's a commentary from the Rosh. So once the trial has begun, Shmuel rules that the court may summon the defendant to hear the testimony, even if the plaintiff isn't ill, even if there aren't any mitigating circumstances. If the defendant then chooses not to come, the court can accept testimony in his absence. So bearing in mind, Shmuel doesn't disagree with Rav Yochanan, who stated earlier that we accept testimony in the defendant's absence only if there's mitigating circumstances, like the witnesses or the plaintiff are ill, or they're on a timeline, etc. But as Shmuel stated explicitly, he's referring to a case that had been opened. Rav Yochanan, on the other hand, speaks of a case that hasn't yet been opened. That's the primary difference. So if a case hasn't been opened, the plaintiff requested that the court hear the testimony of his witnesses and record it for use in the future. But he can't ask them to try the case itself because the defendant is not present to make his plea. But there might be a timeline for the witnesses where you need to at least have it documented in the interim before the actual trial starts. According to Rav Yochanan. According to Shmuel, the case has already started. So Rav Yochanan teaches that a court will comply with the plaintiff's request, but only if there's a specific reason for the urgency. Okay? And there are no mitigating circumstances. But if, however, they had not opened the court case, the defendant can say to the plaintiff, I'm not happy to go to the magistrate's court. I want to go to the high court. So generally what we're saying is that the court of the Nasi in Eretz Israel is the big court. So the defendant might not want to have the case adjudicated before the local court or the municipal court. And he can insist that it be taken to the high court instead. Okay? Now the Gemara says, according to Ravina, we're actually only dealing with a situation where the plaintiff holds a letter from the high court instructing the local court to adjudicate the case. In other words, in view of the letter, the defendant cannot insist that the proceedings be taken before the high court. In other words, because the plaintiff has said that it had to be taken within a local court, for whatever reason, maybe the high court is in a different city, he didn't want to keep schlepping. But if the local court hadn't yet officially opened the case, the defendant may indeed exercise that right despite the plaintiff's letter from the high court, because there's nothing yet opened. Okay. So far, very, very straightforward. And Kev, at what point did I lose you? Kev? Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. I was just using my Bluetooth headset. I'm bringing my mic.
Okay, but what point did I lose you?
You were talking about the litigant, something about the litigant.
Okay, but what point did I lose you?
You're gonna
Did I ever get you?
No.
Did you ever get
Sorry,
me?
I was just trying to sort this out. No, can you go back a few minutes? I need to go on my. Okay, I'll just go repeat what you did. I'm gonna get I need to get onto my bike.
Okay.
You go back 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Give me a sec.
Back to
Yeah.
the future shirt. I hear you read it.
What?
Back to the future shirt.
Yeah,
You read
I see
about
the
you?
shirt. Back to the Future. I get the joke. No, it's tremendously funny, and just either one is. All right. Let me just give you a quick summary without all the conversational pieces. Okay. So the Gemara elaborates on the question of accepting testimony when the litigant against whom it is directed is not present. Rav Ashi said in the name of Rav Shapsai, we accept the testimony of witnesses even in the absence of the litigant against whom it's directed. And Rav Yochanan is confounded by the ruling because it says, do we really accept the testimony of witnesses in the absence of the litigant? So according to Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, he said to him, look, this is the following explanation. They're mitigating circumstances. The plaintiff is ill, or the witnesses are ill, or the witness seeks to go overseas. So any of those are emergency timeline. And in that particular case, we are willing to hear it, whether the defendant is there or not. However, the procedure, in order for it to be effective, is that you have to summon the defendant, but if the defendant didn't come, you can proceed. So the question, Kevin, that arises is there's some issue, because according to Rav Yehuda, who said in the name of Shmuel, we accept witnesses even in the absence of the litigant. So we're saying, like, why do you need mitigating circumstances? Because according to my Ukva, who it was explained to him personally by Shmuel, that the court can only apply that where they opened the case. And they summoned the defendant, but he didn't come. But if however, they hadn't opened the case, the defendant can go to the plaintiff and say, I'm going to the High Court. But the bottom line of this issue is, well, why do you need mitigating circumstances? Because all you have to do is summon the defendant, and if the defendant doesn't come, you can basically carry on with the case because he's chosen to be in breach of the summons. So what do you need mitigating circumstances for, Kevin? That's the question that comes up. And what we're going to basically learn is that there are certain cases where if the defendant is ill and he doesn't come, it's not that he's ignoring the summons, it's that they're mitigating circumstances for him. But it seems as though you can push due process if there are emergencies coming up, which would render the court case ineffectual or crippled or time sensitive. Okay? So the Gemara is saying, listen, it's all very well that the defendant says I'm not coming because I've decided to go to the High Court and I don't like this at the Magistrates Court. So we're saying, well, what happens if there is a letter from the High Court instructing the local court to adjudicate the case? What can the defendant say? So if they'd already opened up the case at the local court, there's nothing the defendant can do. If they hadn't, still proceed to go to the High Court because nothing official has been opened. Okay, so now that we're there,
Can I just ask you something, Damon?
Yeah.
Damon, just one thing very quickly. I thought in order to go to the High Court, you first had to go through the lower courts in order to get up to the higher court. I thought because otherwise I can just take any case that I have willy-nilly and just take it to the High Court. So I thought it had to go through the chain of command.
I think Gavin's asking an excellent point. We learned in Sanhedrin that you can escalate to a higher court, but providing you're not happy with the ruling at the local court already. You can't automatically just escalate it without going to magistrate's court first. I remember learning that with Rav Simcha Steinhauer.
Yes, that's it.
Learn correctly?
Yeah, I learned it as well. Same thing.
Yeah. Gavin, I have no idea. It's an excellent question, mate. I don't know.
No, I'm going from that, purely from what we learned with Rav Simcha Steinhauer.
I suppose
Exactly
that one could say that in a particular case where you're going to a high court. I know in South Africa, I was once summoned at the small claims court in Krugersdorp, and I said, because I don't have leave to appeal in the small claims court, I wish to take this to the higher court. And the person had to then take it to the magistrate's court. And that was taught to my dad by a drunk attorney at Bones restaurant at the bar. He was a permanent alcoholic, but he did teach us one thing. But in terms of Simcha Steinhauer, no, I'm not joking. It was it wasn't my shining moment. But by the way, Gavin, we did learn that in Sanhedrin. I've got no answer for you. The only thing I think that you could bring up is that maybe you can bring a case of prejudice. Maybe you could say at the local court, this person is an important person, and you don't feel you'll get a fair trial because this person is the big shot in the town.
Yeah, I think the direction you're going is I think it has to do with that. I would think they have to motivate a good reason as to why they won't do it in the local court before they just take it up to the high court. But I still don't see why we had those smaller. Well, exactly what we learned in Sanhedrin, where you had
no. Those cases in Sanhedrin were different. One of them, the context of those cases in Sanhedrin is when somebody chose to give a paskin halacha, and he wasn't going according to the majority of the halachic opinion.
No, I'm not referring to that. It's fine. Carry on.
No. But I'm saying this case about court escalation occurred in Sanhedrin because that's a death penalty case. When you're teaching halacha against what the halacha has been agreed by majority rule, and what you're saying is almost like an apikoros. Are you with me? That was the context. Sanhedrin or death penalty cases.
Yeah. Thanks.
Do you remember that? That it was going against halacha, the person who, and there was a whole escalation. Right, Kevin, Arthur,
you
you're still there. I hope we haven't fatigued the guys. Good question, though.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see. Everyone seems to be there.
Kevin, Arthur, you still present? Yeah. All right. Rav said, now we're continuing the discussion about accepting testimony in the absence of the party against whom it's directed. So Rav said we may certify a loan document in the absence of the litigant. What does it mean? The borrower. So what we are saying is when one person produces a loan document against another, and the latter denies liability, the holder of the note cannot collect on that basis under rabbinic law, unless he authenticates the signatures of the witnesses who signed it. And it's a process known as document certification. Okay? So one of the ways to accomplish this is by having the witnesses themselves attest to the authenticity of their own signatures. So what happens then is the court then certifies the document by writing beneath the signatures, we were seated as 3 judges, and so and so and so and so came and testified that these are their signatures, so we reinforce it and certify them.
And if a witness has died, that would be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, it is a bit of a problem, but before we discuss Australia's cases, let's just discuss normal cases.
Just
Okay.
put Kevin on mute there. I think Kevin's the problem.
I
Okay,
did.
thank you.
All right, so Gav. So, all right, so Rav teaches that if witnesses who were signed on a loan document want to travel overseas, okay, this is the circumstance, right? The lender can bring them before the court and have them attest to the authenticity of their signatures, even in the borrower's absence. Why? Because the borrower's denying it. He's not bothering to come to the court, and there's going to be drama. But if the witnesses go overseas, the lender's never going to be able to collect, according to Rashi. So in fact, if the witnesses are going to go abroad, the court has to accept the testimony in the defendant's absence, not only in the case of document certification, Gavin, but also in other monetary cases. Rav specifies, though, that the document certification process here is in order to teach that in this situation, the mitigating circumstances actually, Gavin, suffice on its own, and the court doesn't even need to summon the defendant because the witnesses are going overseas. But in other monetary cases, the defendant must always be summoned. Why? Because this is a cut and dry case. Why? Document certification is required under rabbinic law, and it can be done in the borrower's absence if there are no mitigating circumstances. So one of the mitigating circumstances are obviously, in this case, they don't even have to go overseas. It's just a precautionary measure. You've got somebody that borrowed money and somebody that lent. It's not like a car accident where each party is claiming the other one was wrong. It's cut and dry. So according to the one opinion, there seems to be needs for one of the witnesses to go overseas and there to be mitigating circumstances. In other cases, there doesn't have to for loan documents because a lender is entitled to collect the money from the borrower without shenanigans. So the dissenting view is Rav Yochanan, who says we can't certify a loan document in the absence of the litigant if the borrower isn't there. Why? Because as he explains, Rav Shesha says to Rav Yossi bar Abahu, I will explain Rav Yochanan's reason to you. Because the Pasuk states, if it was an ox that gored habitually and testimony is given against it in the presence of its owner and he did not guard it. And what's this whole thing about? Is that's in Exodus chapter 21, verse 29. And that's the process by which an ox is rendered a muad. Okay? So the owner of the ox should come and stand by his ox when the witnesses testify against him. So according to Rav Yochanan, he extends the scope of this principle to include document certification, and that although document certification is required under rabbinical law only, Rav doesn't extend the principle to such a degree. In other words, Rav is saying that the defendant doesn't have to be there, and Rav Yochanan says, just like with the muad ox, the person didn't gore, the ox did, but he has to be there. In this case, that's where they disagree in terms of where they extend It's one thing if the defendant is summoned and he doesn't arrive. It's another thing if he's not even summoned, Gavin. I would address Kevin and Arthur, but I don't even know if they're present. So,
Yeah,
guys, the Torah instructs the owner of the ox should come and stand by his ox when witnesses testified against it. So these are the two opinions. Okay, we've got Rav, who said that as far as that's concerned, the defendant doesn't have to be there. And Rav Yochanan said that even if the defendant doesn't have to be there, he has to be summoned. If he doesn't come there, it's his problem. So Rava actually determines the law. And the law is that we may certify a loan document in the absence of the litigant, in this case, the borrower. And even if the borrower stands in court and shouts, "Don't certify it, it's forged," we don't listen to him, and we can proceed with the certification. Why? Because he doesn't claim to have proof of the falsity of the documentation. So it's just a last minute, what do you call it, twitch to try and get out of it. But if the borrower says, "Listen, I want you to give me time until I bring witnesses and disqualify the document," we give him time. Okay, so that means if he says, "Listen, I actually can substantiate it," even after the court has certified the document and ordered the borrower to pay the debt, and he can claim that the document is false or that the witnesses are conspiring, we give him the time. And the proviso is we have to see that there's some merit in his claim. So the court allots him the amount of time it will take to assess what it would take to bring his particular witnesses or his evidence. But should the court be unable to make an assessment, it gives him 30 days. So what's the overlying principle about giving him time? Because he could end up, you might say, he could end up buying himself a year's worth of time. So no, he has to bring a claim forward in terms of what his problem is. If there's evidence to his claim, he says he needs to get it, but it sounds logical enough. They assess how much time he needs. If they're not sure what would be a plausible amount of time, the default position is 30 days. Does that make sense, Gav? Okay. So if he does not come by that time, we wait for him the following Monday, Thursday, and Monday. Why? It's actually 3 weeks. Because if the court summons the borrower to appear on Monday, he doesn't come then. It summons him to appear not on that week's Thursday, but on the following Thursday. Fine. If he doesn't come there either, it summons him to appear on the next Monday. So the court sits on Mondays and Thursdays. So it basically gives him a week's grace per time, which is reasonable. So when they say it's 30 days, that's the default position. But in this case, it seems as if there's like 21 days, according to this opinion. So if he still doesn't come, we write him a bill of excommunication, and he remains excommunicated for 90 days because he didn't pay his debt. So why does the court wait for 90 days? Until it authorizes the lender to collect the borrower's property for payment of the loan. And at that point, the borrower is released from excommunication. Now, it's not like today, guys, where you excommunicate somebody and they're only too happy they don't have to come to shore. They've got a heter. In those days, people wanted to come to shore, and their whole community would know that they're a pariah. They couldn't do certain transactions. They weren't part of the community. And how are you going to get excommunicated in a society where you're in a ghetto? It won't last 2 minutes. So why do they do it for 90 days? Because the first 30 days, we don't descend upon his property to collect what he owes. Okay? Why? Because one could say that maybe he's occupied with borrowing money to pay the debt. And in the intermediate 30 days, although he's still under excommunication, the reason we don't collect and descend upon his property is that maybe we can say that he didn't find the money to borrow and he's occupied with selling property or assets in order to find the necessary funds. And in the last 30 days, we don't descend upon his property because you could say that he found a buyer for his property, but the buyer himself is occupied with obtaining money to pay for his purchase. And if at the end of 90 days he still has not come, we write a seizure warrant on his property. Okay? So generally a debtor who claims to be unable to pay his debt is given only 30 days to find the funds. But in this case, however, where the debtor claims that he can prove the document is forged, although we don't really believe him entirely, it's demonstrated because we excommunicate him, we take his claim into account in the fact that there's a delay for an additional 60 days. Okay? So the court grants 90-day extension only when it has reason to believe that he's trying to raise the money, that he's trying to make some sort of an effort. But if there's no sort of effort, it authorizes collection immediately. Okay? And then the court writes a document for the lender that entitles him to enter the borrower's premises and seizes property as payment of the debt. That's a seizure document. Okay. So, I tell you what, I'm happy to